Well, I hope you are able to see the word file as well.
Yes.
Well, okay. So today we are going to discuss about one new trend of writing history that has become popular very recently, and that is called subaltern history writing. And before we go ahead, we need to understand what is the meaning of subaltern. Now, this word generally used for those people. Earlier it was used for in European countries for those military people who were working at the lower ranks. And later on, the word always, the meaning of the word doesn't remain static. It goes on changing over a period of time. And that is what happened with this word as well. Though initially used for the people who are working at the lower level, called inferior ranks in the army, later on, the word begin to be used for anybody who is deprived of their rights, any kind of marginalization. Now, this marginalization can be of any type. For example, in the class-based structure, upper class and lower class. So, lower class is marginalized section. Upper class is monopolizing the resources. Caste in the context of Indian caste, Indian system, Indian social system, it is the lower caste who can be called subaltern. In case of age, it is many times children whose rights are not being protected, or the elderly people whose rights are also not being protected as they have weaker, many times their children drive them out of the house. They can be called subaltern. In terms of gender, it is generally, the male and female gender, there is a kind of discrimination. There is a kind of subaltern needy. In the office, upper officers and other office staff, there is just a kind of differences. So subaltern, in general, if you take a kind of bird's eye view of history, people begin to realize that in the historical tradition, it is the elite class. Elite in any sense could be a financial elite, could be the caste elite in case of Indian context, could be cultural elite. All these people, they have occupied the large writing space in the historical writing, and those people who are deprived of their right, they did not find adequate place in the historical tradition. And in order to study the history of this marginalized class, a new trend have started in history writing. That is what is generally known as subaltern history. So in nutshell, in short, subaltern history is study of the marginalized people, and marginalization can be of any level, any type. And as meaning I have already told you, the meaning of subaltern is inferior rank, and initially it was used for the people who were working at the inferior level, below captain. And Ashok Sen, he described subaltern. Subaltern is general subordination in terms of class, caste, age, gender, office, or any other way. And the person who made this term subaltern very popular is Antonio Gramsci. Antonio Gramsci was Italian Marxist, and he was imprisoned by Mussolini's regime as he was opposed to Mussolini's policies. Is there anybody from Hindi medium? Only you two are. Sharayu, are you from Hindi medium?
No, sir.
No, Sharayu. Sahili is also from English medium. You both are from English medium. Okay, fine. So, this Antonio Gramsci, he was imprisoned by the Mussolini government in Italy. And this Antonio Gramsci was in fact Marxist. And Marxist, they divide the population into the two category, have and have nots. Now, Antonio Gramsci, he in prison, he started writing his papers, that is later on published as a selection from prison notebook. He started writing his diary, he started corresponding with people. So here he felt that, as he was under a watch by the police of Mussolini, he felt that if he uses the word have and have not, that is generally used by the Marxist narrative, probably he will not be allowed to write, and his papers will be seized, and some more cases will be imposed on him, and he will be given more severe punishment. So in order to deceive the authority, he started using the term subaltern for the have-nots and elite for the have. So, Marxists have divided the society into the two groups, have and have not. And To begin with, Antonio Gramsci has used the alternative word, that is elite and subaltern. Now, though he started his narrative from there, over a period of time, he enlarged the definition of subaltern, because in case of Marxist narrative, the deprivation is mainly economic deprivation. He divides the society, which is mainly based on who is monopolizing the economic resources. The person who is having access to resources, monopolizing the resources, is known as have. The person who does not is known as have-nots. But Gramsci felt that it's not only the economic deprivation, it's not the economic marginalization that the people face. The marginalization can be at different level. It could be gender marginalization, it could be linguistic marginalization, it could be cultural marginalization. And that is how the subaltern word has become more comprehensive than have-nots. In case of have-not, under the Marxist definition, it is the economic deprivation. But in case of subaltern, as defined by Gramsci, anybody who is deprived of any cultural right, any economic right, any gender right, and he is being treated as a kind of inferior person, is being termed as subaltern. I hope the definition of subaltern is clear. In nutshell, in short, anybody who is not being treated with equality, anybody who is deprived of his legitimate right, it could be economical, linguistic, gender right, that person can be categorized as a subaltern person. And this trend mainly focuses on understanding where there is a subalternity, how the people are deprived, how they are being marginalized, so on and so forth. So that trend is generally known as subaltern history writing. And here, Antonio Gramsci, in his narration, he developed two important concepts of hegemony. And hegemony means having control over somebody. And hegemony can be of two types. Remember this. This is a very, very, very insightful understanding of hegemony. For example, a man may make his wife subaltern in his home. And many times, that subalternity is coercive subalternity. Coercive means something that is imposed on force. Now, he may tell his wife that if you don't listen to me or if you don't obey my orders, I will not give you money, or I will not buy clothes for you, or you will not be given food, and so on and so forth. So this is a very obvious the hegemony that is imposed by force, that is called hegemony with coercion. And there is something that is called hegemony with consent. Hegemony with consent means psychologically itself that woman is convinced that it is her sacred duty to obey her husband. Like, generally it is done in the Indian religious, sociological, social tradition. That is, woman is expected to be Prativrata. That is, dedicated to her husband and always being remaining obedient to her. And that she is convinced since beginning, through the text, through the narration, through the tradition, that it is her sacred duty to take care of her husband and his family, even at the cost of her own comfort. So she accepts her subordinate position with consent. She take it as it is her duty. So that is called hegemony with consent. You got these two concepts. Hegemony with coercion is something that is forced, something that is threatened, that if you don't obey, you will be punished. And hegemony with consent is something when you accept your subordinate position willingly. And that willingness comes by conditioning of your mind. All right. Well, let us go ahead now. Now, the person who made this subaltern term quite popular in the context of the Indian history, or in the context of history of South Asia, is Ranjit Guha. He was in England, and he studied this Gramsci's work, and then he realized that the kind of terminology that Gramsci is using for the deprived people, that is subaltern, can be very aptly applicable to the people of South Asia, because these people had been deprived of their legitimate right because of the hegemony imposed over them by the European power for centuries. And that is how the subaltern studies, he gathered some people together, and then they started writing the collection of essays called Subaltern Studies, starting onwards from 1982 onwards. So you see this subaltern trend is very latest. And later on, Subaltern Studies Volume 1, 2, 3, like that, Subaltern Studies, 12 volumes have been published so far. And these subaltern studies, they generally focus on that section of the society about which we don't find much written in the history, like, life of peasant, life of factory workers, life of tribals, and so on and so forth. Well, so in this group, there were different people who went on contributing to these essays written in the 12 volumes. Some of the important essays in this volume, we will be discussing it later on. But these are the people who were generally allied with the Subaltern Studies group. That is Shahid Amin, Ranjit Guha, Partha Chatterjee, Gyanendra Pandey, Gyan Prakash, Ramchandra Guha, Dipesh Chakravarti, and Gayatri Spivak. All right. So, broadly speaking, though subaltern is a study of the people who are deprived of their right, Ranjit Guha, he generally defined the broad framework with which the subalterns are working. So, this what Ranjit Guha or the subaltern they try to describe is that the history that is written in modern India, it's mostly written by the elite, for the elite, and it expresses the opinion of the elite class. And this elite class, they were the leader of the Indian national movement, and they were generally given credit. For example, though Mahatma Gandhi, he lived the life of voluntarily poverty, but he was still coming from the elite class. He could go to England, take the barrister degree there, and he was a qualified lawyer. So he was intellectually elite. He did not use that talent to earn money, but became popular leader. That is a different story, no doubt about it. But nevertheless, the main intention, main thing that this subaltern points out is that when we study the history of national movement, we don't study what the peasants thought about freedom. We don't study what the labor thought about freedom. Did they really understood the difference between the rule of the British and rule of the Indian? Historians have generally not bothered to probe that, and what they had been generally focusing is on life of Mahatma Gandhi, different movements that is led by Mahatma Gandhi, life of Jawaharlal Nehru, life of Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, and he called all these group as a kind of elite group. And the history writing, it generally focus on this elite group, as if these are the people who have fought against the Britishers and gave us independence. Did the whatever the inspiration of the peasant, whatever the inspiration, how the women were affected, these are all coming under the category of subaltern. They generally figure out in the mainstream history. Even if they figure out, they figure out as a follower. They don't generally figure out as a kind of catalyst, or the kind of people who are like movers and shakers, who can lead and they have their own independent thinking. We don't find that kind of portrayal or that kind of narration about their place in the history writing. Guys, are you understanding this, or you are finding it too complicated? I'm trying to simplify it as possible as I can, but in a nutshell, always keep it at the back of your mind that subaltern history is nothing but the history of the deprived class, and deprivation can be of any type. All right. This is already I have explained. This is a little bit of elaboration. If you after the lecture, if you read this, you will understand it well. Well, then while analyzing the causes of the rise of nationalism in India, many historians have made a statement that this was the result of the Western education, and they have ignored the intrinsic inspiration of the Indian people. All right. Mm, uh, Subaltern also had some differences with Marxism, because Marxism, they always believed that when the revolution will happen, Marx believed that revolution is bound to happen one day or another. And he also narrated that, he also believed that, he raised a thesis that the working class will be led by intelligentsia, and that is where the subaltern also disagree with Marx. They say that no, the leadership should come from the subaltern class themselves, and to correct biasness in the history writing, uh, subalterns, they suggest certain things. For example, mm, people who were deprived of their right, their history should be studied. In the mass movement, what were the inspiration of the common people, that should also be studied. Well, lifestyle of the common people, that should be studied. Uh, Indian society is not homogeneous as generally being pursued. It is having a lot of marginalized group. It is having elite, so their aspiration needs to be studied. The elite, they generally use marginalized group for their own benefit and later on ignore them. And subaltern historian, they try to address this lacuna, this shortcoming in the history writing. In the beginning, we find that subaltern, they, subject matter and perception of the subaltern were peasant, workers, and tribal. And that is the general subject area that they study. The revolt of the tribal, that they generally try to study. And it's very difficult sometimes to find the sources for the subaltern studies, because subaltern people, they generally don't find place in the recorded history. So in order to understand their history, many times we have to explore non-conventional sources like traditional songs and so on. Now, this is the general framework, general background of subaltern history. I told you. Let us talk about Ranjit Guha. His reference has already came. It was in fact Ranjit Guha who has taken an initiative to form the group called Subaltern Studies and publish under Subaltern Studies 12 volumes are published. Out of that, first 6 are edited by Ranjit Guha. Ranjit Guha was born in 1922. He was influenced by the Marxist thought. He taught at different places like India, England, Australia, and he finally settled in Australia. His reading of Gramsci has given him new insight, and he applied that subaltern word to the people of South Asia. In England, he took initiative, and it is because of his initiative that Center for South Asian Cultural Studies that came into existence in England. And apart from that, editing of the 6 volume of Subaltern Studies and contributing numerous essays, he wrote number of books: The Rule of Property for Bengal, Elementary Aspect of Peasant Insurgency in Colonial India, Dominance Without Hegemony, History and Power in Colonial India, History at the Limit of World History, and Indian Historiography of India. And this I have already told you. And then Selected Subaltern Studies, that is the book that he edited with another important subaltern historian, subaltern thinker called Gayatri Spivak. Now, I'll give you a little bit of information about what his different book tries to tell us. The Rule of Property for Bengal, he makes analysis of the reason behind the permanent settlement that the Britishers brought in West Bengal, in Bengal that time, and how it had affected the life of the people. In elementary aspect of peasant insurgency, he makes analysis how the deprived group of people they revolt, whether the revolt or spontaneous or planned, and how the leadership developed. And these tribal revolts, he says that they're generally quite different from the nationalistic inspiration. The nationalistic leader, they tried to make it as a part of the nationalist movement, but that is not the complete story. Then in his book, History at the Limit of World History, he makes analysis of the history written so far, and there he shows the defects that has crept into the history writing. And he analyzes that we have already studied the imperialistic history. Everybody has tried to justify their own intention by using history. Imperialistic historians have tried to tell us that Indian people are not capable of ruling themselves. They are backward people, and their intention was to justify their rule. And that is also being pointed out in this book, History at the Limit of World History. So, history has become tool in the hands of the elite classes. Then next book, Dominance Without Hegemony. Here he highlights the difference between the political and administrative structure in Europe and what came into effect in India under the British rule. Here in Western countries, as they were ruling over their own people, it was always the rule by consent. But here, it is being imposed on the people, and Indian people hardly had any say in the deciding the nature of the British administration. This his next text, An Indian Historiography of India. It is a collection of three speeches, and he makes an analysis of the historiographical tradition that started under the British rule, and he gives a lot of credit to Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, that Bankim Chandra Chatterjee has started writing history through Indian perspective, and well, he also makes an analysis why in 1857 revolt, many of the educated Indian classes they supported Britishers and they did not join hands with the people who were revolting against the British rule. Uh, so broadly speaking, I'm probably repeating this. The subaltern studies they discuss about the peasant, factory worker, tribal, their oaths, their problem, their aspiration, and how they are being deprived of their legitimate rights. It talks about the insurgency of workers, peasant, and Adivasis. How these Adivasis they generally became victim of the conspiracy of wicked landlord, dishonest trader, police, and official. So all these people who are elite class, they join hands together because they have vested interest, and the result is marginalization of the Adivasi, the tribal people. I took some certain few samples, essays, which will give us an insight what kind of matter is being built in the subaltern studies. For example, in Subaltern Studies 1, Volume 1, David Arnold, he talks about the rebellion of hillman in Andhra Pradesh in 19th century. Then he talks about Madras famine in the Subaltern Studies 3. And he says that while discussing about the famine policies of the British government, or while discussing about the writing the history of the famine, it is the government policies which were mostly highlighted by the historian, and how the life of the general common masses has been affected, that is not being taken into account, that is not being recorded. Gyan Pandey in the Subaltern Studies, he wrote about the uh, revolt, peasant revolt in Awadh in 1922, which doesn't find place in the generally accepted mainstream history. So you see, mainstream history, which is mainly focusing on the elite work like Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru and Sardar Patel, these people have tried to take those things which had been ignored by this mainstream history, peasant revolt, hillman's revolt, and then um, uh, Arvind Das, he writes that, in 1947, Vinoba Bhave has conducted Bhudan movement, and he toured all over the country, and he requested the Zamindar that they should give their land in Dan, in donation, and that land will be later on handed over to the landless people, and that is being made as a very important work. But here he explores that though it is a good work, no doubt about it, but if that could have not been done, probably there would have been a widespread revolt of the landless people, and it could have created a lot of chaos and anarchy. That was not generally being written in the mainstream history. Then N.K. Chandra in Subaltern Studies 2, he talks about the poor condition of the agricultural labor. See, agricultural labor never became a part of history, but it is because of these subaltern studies that we are studying the topic like history of labor, history of meal worker in particular region. All right. Then in subaltern studies too, Dipesh Chakravarti, he studies the condition of Calcutta jute mill workers, and he says that that jute mill worker, their leader, now they are becoming new elite. So the jute mill workers, they are coming from the worker class, but once they became politically powerful, they started behaving like zamindar. They started, now zamindar is being replaced with a babu. So he will, dictate what is to be done. So he is having an hegemony. So, there is a subalternity within subalternity. Lastly, while criticizing the subaltern concept, we'll discuss that how difficult it is to define what subaltern means. Well, Ramchandra Guha in his essay in Subaltern Studies 4, he talks about forestry and social protest in British Kumaon. in 1893 to 1921, and he explored how these British policies that has provoked the violent opposition to the British policies by this traditionally very peaceful hillman. So that is about the contribution of Dr. Ranjit Guha. He has kind of pioneering work he has done. He has defined the framework, number of books he has written. He had started the trend of writing the collection of essays titled Subaltern Studies. And there are different books, Rule of Bengal, Elementary Aspects of Peasant Insurgency, where he tries to understand the history of insurgency of peasant under the British rule. Mm, well, now we will go to the next important subaltern historian in India, that is Dr. Sumit Sarkar. He was professor of Delhi University and was generally known for his very independent thinking. He was kind of initially he was Marxism. He remained Marxism. Remember one thing, that somebody is a Marxist historian, and if he switches over to subaltern or he contributes to subaltern studies, that does not mean that he is being seized to be Marxist. He can be Marxist, but still he can be contributing to the subaltern studies. And a very important example is Dr. Sumit Sarkar. Mm. And his general area is masses in the national movement. As I have already told you earlier, in the national movement, it is the work of the elite class that was the main focus of the historian. But he talks about the masses. Then he writes about history of subaltern, Mahatma Gandhi's leadership, administrative structure of the British administration. And among the different writing, the important books, that is Swadeshi movement in Bengal, written by Professor Sarkar, popular movement and middle class leadership in the late colonial India, perspective and problem of history from below. So in the subaltern, they always try to understand the history from below and not from top. History from the top means trying to understand the history from the elite perspective, and history from below means trying to understand the history from the perspective of the subaltern who are deprived of their rights. Then writing social history, modern India. These are the important books. Then apart from that, there are certain essays by Professor Sarkar which had became very popular, like Limits of Nationalism, Decline of Subaltern in Subaltern Studies, Beyond Nationalistic Frame. These are the important essays. Well, now while analyzing Sumit Sarkar's work, uh, we must understand that the modern India, which came out in 1983, the period is 1847 and 1947. That book is very important because it gives a lot of space to workers and peasant movement, apart from the important elite political elites. So it gives a lot of space and try to understand the problem of the worker and peasant and how they came united, how they were being deprived of their right, and then they became the part of the anti-colonial, anti-British movement in India. Um, he says that canvas of history should be broad, and history writing should not only concentrate on leadership, but also try to understand the contribution of peasant, worker, tribal, hill people. And he says that the people who rebelled against the British rule, all of them did not had a similar aspiration. Some people different people had different aspiration, which is generally dependent on the geographical factor and tradition. For example, the hope from the freedom of the jute worker in Kolkata was definitely different than the people who were working in the agriculture or people who were working in the tea plantation area. All right. Then writing social history is his book, that is a collection of 8 essays where he described the nature of the British colonial rule and also highlight the importance of minor events. Then his very famous article, that is Decline of the Subaltern in the Subaltern Studies. Here also he tries to identify the attitude of the ignored group. Sarkar, he became very popular in 2000 AD because in 2000 AD, one important episode has happened. Indian Council of Historical Research, they were publishing documents related to the Indian freedom struggle. And, while the large number of documents were collected from the different places, and that documents, Sardar Panikar and Dr. Sumit Sarkar, they were editing it and giving it for publication to ICHR. And they found certain documents which would have raised a lot of questions about the politicians of the contemporary period. And it's because of the pressure of that politician, ICHR has refused to publish those volumes. And then this became a very important controversial point. all over, as Sumit Sarkar was communist also, he was contributing to subaltern, no doubt about it. All over the world, a lot of communist people, they came forward, communist intelligentsia, they came forward and they supported Panikkar and Sumit Sarkar. That episode made him very popular. And though initially Sarkar was, he was with subaltern studies, but later on he developed certain differences with the group. He now started begin to feel that, as he was trained Marxist, so he always felt that economic history is very important. And he began to feel that in subaltern studies now, economic history is being taken backseat and it is a cultural subordination or cultural studies that is getting more importance, literary studies that is getting more importance. So he somehow left that group later on, but nevertheless, his contribution to subaltern studies is very important. Now let us talk about certain problems with, you might be facing, most probably you are going to face MCQ type of examination. So you must remember what are the books written by which historian belongs to which group. You might be getting that kind of questions, all right? Mm. Then the concept, what are the problem, what are the objections of historian about the concept subaltern? See, the concept of subaltern itself is a bit problematic. Whom you can call subaltern? For example, generally, if you call farmer as the subaltern in relation to the businessman, but it is quite possible that within the farming community, there might be some super rich people who are having large number of agricultural land. So how can you just call all the farmers are being, subaltern? And it is quite possible that a subaltern at one place may make somebody else as subaltern at another place. For example, I will give one simple example. If in a village there is a farmer who is having few acres of land and he is forced to sell his product to the merchant at a low rate during the cropping season, during the harvesting season. So he is subaltern now because he is being deprived of his right by the merchant. Merchant is taking advantage of his situation. He is buying the product at the low rate and selling it at a higher rate in the city market. So it is a merchant who is earning the profit, no doubt about it. But now that farmer is subaltern, but that farmer is having one agricultural labor working in his land. Now, in comparison to that farmer and agricultural labor, now the agricultural labor becomes subaltern because agricultural labor has to work throughout the day, and at the end of the day, he is paid very less money. Now, agricultural labor is subaltern, but now take the situation now again changing. At the end of the day, let us say he is paid 50 rupees as his wages, but while going home, he pays around 25 rupees on his drinks and gives only 25 rupees to his wife and asks her to run the house. And in case she protests, he will start beating her. Now here again, his wife has become subaltern. So you see, the subaltern is a term which is a bit vague, very difficult to define. If you call all the tribal as a subaltern, within the tribal community, there are certain very rich people, very rich tribal. If you call all the women as a subaltern, then again there are certain women who make life of their own husband hell. They will just torture their husband. So you can't call them subaltern. So it's very difficult. It's a misleading concept. That is how many historians they object it. They say that subaltern as a very independent branch of history is not necessary. In any case, we are studying about the deprived class. We are studying about the class struggle under Marxism, so on and so forth. So this is one of the important objection that subaltern is a term which is very difficult to define. Then subaltern, they divide the society into the two class, that is elite and subaltern, and this is a very vague. It's not very right. Too simplistic division. What about the middle class? Middle class, you cannot call them elite because they are struggling, working. They don't have a lot of money, always under the financial strain. They are neither subaltern. They at least they get adequate food, adequate the relatively comfortable home. So it's very difficult. So this is the too simplistic division of the society, elite and subaltern. And next thing is that those subaltern object that the leadership of the subaltern should come from the subaltern community. Many times we find that subalterns movement are also led by the elite class. So if you want to if you make an analysis, so this subaltern, nevertheless, in spite of this objection, this was a different trend in history writing, and it challenged the stereotypical history writing that elite work and elite life is to be highlighted in the history writing. And it was quite brave. It challenged the very prevailing notion of history writing. And the subaltern history writing had attracted the attention of those who remained ignored so far. uh, uh, they have brought to the notice the resources which had remained ignored so far. Earlier, as most of the a lot of importance was given to the written sources, Subaltern had brought many non-conventional, like folk songs, folk stories that they have brought into the mainstream history writing. And it has also recorded the history of small groups, small region, which was generally being ignored in the mainstream history. And in Maharashtra, much before Gramsci's work, it was Jyotiba Phule who had given vent to the grievances of the marginalized section, though he was not called subaltern. So this is where we end our lecture on subaltern studies. So in a nutshell, subaltern studies or subaltern history is history of the deprived class. And here we have two important people, Ranjit Guha and Sumit Sarkar. Ranjit Guha has done a very phenomenal pioneering work, and Sumit Sarkar has generally tried to focus on the aspiration and the contribution of the common masses in the nationalistic movement. So here we end our lecture on the subaltern studies. In case you are having any doubt, you can ask me. Just a minute.